Welcome back to the Indy 500 podcast, and thank you for listening as always. Today, we're taking a little pit stop, as we like to call it, to dive into a topic that has really grabbed our attention, whether via one of our episodes, from listening to new music, or as an opportunity to share something we find special with you, the audience. On episode 14, we had a chance to immerse ourselves in John Coltrane and the light that this album, A Love Supreme, shined down upon earth. We were both in awe and given a whole new way to think of what it is to be a musician, where does influence come from, and ultimately, what impact can music have on one person, let alone an entire community. One such story we touched on was the spiritual impact it had on Franzo and Marina King the night of September 18th, 1965. While celebrating their anniversary, they had decided to make a night of popping into different jazz clubs around San Francisco. They had started the evening with none other than John Coltrane himself. Upon taking the stage, the Kings felt the presence of the Holy Spirit moving with him and speaking to them through his music. They refer to that event as their sound baptism. From there, they have devoted the last 60 years to seeking spirituality, being a beacon of good for their community, and spreading the word of the Coltrane consciousness through what became the St. John Coltrane Church. I am beyond thrilled today to be able to welcome Dr. Nicholas Baham. He is a professor of ethnic studies at California State East Bay, the writer of many fantastic books, and one relating to this episode, which I can't recommend highly enough. It is called The Coltrane Church, Apostles of Sound, Agents of Social Justice, as well as a proud member of the St. John Coltrane Church. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. Did I miss anything there in introducing you?
No, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming on.
We're thrilled. We were, absolutely floored to see, the impact that this album had. And, one thing we'd love to hear, once they had their sound by baptism, what were the early days of the church like? What was kind of the starting days going on there?
So the first thing first let's back up to the sound baptism itself. What's interesting about the sound baptism that I write about in the Coltrane Church is that there's this unique communication between audience and performer, the likes of which I don't think we see today. I think that some of that has to do with the way that music is presented to us, particularly through streaming, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're in a concert, and in particular in an intimate concert environment, maybe something like a small club environment. We have that out here with Yoshi's. SF Jazz has a couple of smaller rooms. Unless you're in one of those kinds of smaller jazz clubs, it's difficult to get a sense of what that intimate conversation could be like between a performer and an audience member, right?
No, absolutely. I can't imagine that happening at a football stadium. I mean, that's 70,000 people and me trying to, find a communication.
Yeah, you're more likely to find it if you get a chance to attend a practice.
Yes.
There you go.
So what Franzo and Marina King bring to this event is they bring a sense of wanting to be agents for change in their community, particularly spiritually. So they are ready to receive a message. Whether or not that actually comes from Coltrane or not, they're not clear. They say, hey, look, we showed up there expecting just to have a good time, and that's accurate.
Right.
But by the same token, they were two people who were actively thinking about change. They were existing this happened in the 60s, in which people were talking about change. There's a culture and a climate of civil unrest. Things need to change. And they're in San Francisco, where things are changing, right? So
very progressive, yeah.
Right. And the other thing is that it's also an environment in which Black folks maybe are a little bit more open. It's not in the mainstream by any sense, but there are perhaps more Black folks who are open to experimenting with religion outside of traditional Christianity.
Right.
Okay? So all those things are happening. And then on the other side, Coltrane has presented himself as a spiritual avatar. He has said that he wants to be a saint. He has talked about his life being saved by the grace of God.
And
Literally,
were they aware of that before they had gone to the show?
everyone apparent that I've talked to who was around during this period seems to have been aware on some level that Coltrane was becoming an elevated figure.
Mm.
But to understand it to that degree, no. That required deeper study and meditation from them. And then it required being at this performance in which they claimed that as Coltrane performed, he was looking at them and directing his horn at them and urging them with his horn to think about something or do something. And, Coltrane talks about changing the initial thought patterns through music, using music as that power to specifically change the initial thought patterns. And music does do that. I mean, this is something that I think, I don't want to claim that this is a conspiracy, but capitalism destroys that, right?
Yes.
Mass marketing destroys that. Corporatizing anything destroys that element that an artist might want to present. Ultimately, all music is about communication. And ultimately, all music that comes from a West African tradition is coming out of a communal context. So that if you've ever been in anywhere in West Africa, one of the uncanny things is that it doesn't really matter where you are, whether you're in a village or you're in an urban setting. Most people around you either know how to play a musical instrument or how to sing or how to dance the traditional dances.
Oh, I love that.
Right? So then any event that you hold, whether it's a wedding or a funeral, becomes a fully participatory event. The notion of spectators is a little foreign. The closest that we have to this kind of concept you'll find in New Orleans with the second line. So you don't just watch people parading down the street, although that does happen during Mardi Gras. But you'll also see the second line where people who are not in the parade are dancing alongside the parade and participating. So I think what happened here at the sound baptism, and by the way, there were two. There was this initial sound baptism, and then they saw Coltrane really towards the end of his life in another set where he had two drummers. Probably Rashid Ali was there. And I think he may have had two bass players as well. And he was moving in a much more avant-garde direction. But I think what may have happened here is that they found themselves in a spiritual, communal, very African-centered event. Coltrane used to call his music African classical music.
Oh.
Not necessarily jazz. He's not the only one to claim that amongst some of the jazz legends.
Is that just to help give it more of a cultural identity from his point of view? Or I guess what's the...
Yeah, and then to help you understand really what it is, what the tradition is. I mean, if you break apart the constituent elements of what Coltrane is playing, he developed his own pentatonics. Well, those 5-note scales derive from West African music. The pentatonics, in fact, are the foundation for the blues, which is the foundation for jazz music. And then there's a lot of blues in what he's doing. And as Coltrane would say, you'll find quotes where he talks about making it heavy on the bottom, a lot of bass, and having a drummer like Elvin Jones who can beat out cross rhythms. Those are all West African musical forms, if you will. Not to mention the number of albums that make specific references to Africa, whether that's Dahomey or Kuluse Mama, he knows, or African Brass. He knows exactly where the music comes from. And I think when he sang that, he's situating himself within a much longer tradition that comes before people were forcibly brought to America, and seeing himself as part of a broader continuity. So I think that both Franzo and Marina, when they showed up here, they found themselves in the middle of something that they did not anticipate. It was a prayer. It was kind of a roots awakening type of a thing, right? And they responded to it. The first thing that they did to get to your question.
Hey, this is incredible context. Question aside,
This is the right point.
Okay. Because I did want to get to the point too. But the first thing that they did was they started a club, and it was called the Yardbird Club. And at the Yardbird Club, technically, this is what makes what they do a kind of a community jazz organization. So yes, they're a church, but they have origins in kind of creating a off the books club where musicians who are performing elsewhere during the course of the evening can come later that night and actually experiment. Right, which was really kind of also going on with a lot of the clubs in the Fillmore. So you would do what you had to do at the Jazz Workshop or someplace else in North Beach for the white-owned clubs, but then you might show up at a black-owned club in the Western Addition, or in this case at the Yardbird Club, obviously named after Charlie Parker, in the Bayview Hunters Point, and experiment with sound. So they were doing that. And then they were listening, deep listening to the music, because Coltrane urges repeated listening. So these folks they're not just listening to the music, they're paying attention to everything in the liner notes, everything that John Coltrane has said in interviews. They are learning how John Coltrane eats, when John Coltrane meditates, which he tells you in his album Meditation. He gives you, each song is titled for a time of the day to meditate. They're doing that according to that, and they're building something that they will call Coltrane consciousness, which is literally an attempt to live your life the way that Coltrane showed you how to live your life. Vegetarian diet.
And even in our kind of limited experience, you're talking about pulling all together like the liner notes and the extra things. Like, I forget exactly how many. I think we've done 15 or 16 main episodes, but Love Below really was probably the first time where I felt like that was something you could really do. Is like the repeated listings, studying into the liner notes, and like everything that we were researching felt like it looped back. And like every time I would learn more, and then I would listen to the album again, which is easy because it's not that long. It's a great listen. But every time, and this being a little bit of my first time really sitting down and trying to study a jazz album, like you can kind of feel that, and you can kind of hear it. Like everything that's extraneous is giving, it's adding to the listen every time you do this.
That's right. And, Coltrane is finding a variety of ways to tell you that. So, for example, with A Love Supreme, which is a 4-part suite, you have acknowledgement, resolution, pursuance, and song. That's 4 steps in a path to coming to God. So he's telling you how to do it. You have to have a period of acknowledging both what's come before this moment and what's going forward, and acknowledging the existence of God. And I'll add something to that in just a minute, okay? Because Coltrane did believe in the unity of spiritual ideals. So resolution. Well, once you've made that acknowledgement, you resolve to act. Now, you have set your heart on moving forward. definitively. Pursuance is that action of, trying to exist in some relationship with God or the universe, however you want to think of this. And then psalm is a prayer. And the beauty of the prayer in psalm is that if you play the music and read the liner notes, you will realize that Coltrane is playing the words in the liner notes. So it is a prayer. He gives you the notes for it, and he gives you the words for it, and you can sing it while he's playing.
Yeah, we had touched on that a little bit, but just that idea of being able to speak, in his own language, through his saxophone and communicate these ideas is just so profound to us, and such a wonderful thing compared to so many people that use that opportunity for music just to put nonsense out in the world, or the wrong messages.
Yeah, and I was really thinking when you were mentioning, that they felt they were being communicated to in a new way, and that he was, that he was trying to tell them something. That's what my mind had gone to. I said, when I think of the image of him, playing towards them, I think, well, yeah, of course he had tried to do a form of that before too. He was reading the psalm through his playing to people.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's not the only time that he did that on record. In fact, I do a lecture. I really enjoy doing this. I've done this several times. I like to do a lecture where I present the audio of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s eulogy for the 4 girls who were killed in the bombing in the church in Alabama. And then if you play Coltrane's Alabama, you realize that Coltrane is mimicking the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's eulogy. So it has the exact same arc as the eulogy, and beginning with that somber note. And then if you notice, the piece actually swings a little bit in the middle. And then it ends with that wonderful crescendo of hope, that same note of hope that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. ends his eulogy with. And those two were really in communication in some interesting ways, because King had been to a festival, I believe in Europe, where he talked about the value of jazz, and he mentioned something about the role that jazz was playing in the civil rights movement. And of course, there were a lot of different musical forms that could claim to be the soundtrack for the civil rights movement. Soul music was certainly one of them, but jazz was also one. And it feels as though he does that, and then he delivers his eulogy, and Coltrane is responding back to him, and that they've had this kind of dialogue going back and forth in sound.
It's so amazing. I mean, talk about two of the greatest, in their respective fields, just working together like that. It's a thought.
Yeah, and forgive me if I've gotten that wrong. It might be that the chronology, I need to check this again for you, but that the chronology may be the eulogy, then Alabama, and then King's comments on jazz music.
Yeah, I know that does sound familiar. I had a chance to watch the documentary Chasing Train a couple of weeks ago, and they touched on that. And it's just such a somber reason to express in song. But you're right, though, it absolutely comes out of it, with his vision of hope, and it's kind of the power that both of them had. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Is there any chance that European Jazz Festival, was it the Montreux in one of the I forget where that's held, but the Montreux Festival seemed to pop up multiple times as we're talking about different albums.
I think that's a possibility. I seem to remember something in Germany. I need to go back in my notes for it. So pardon me for not being prepared.
Oh no, you're in good company for that sort of thing on this podcast.
Okay.
So the Yardbird Club's established. They start working, on this Coltrane consciousness. I guess we're kind of curious, what were some of
Yeah.
the core tenets adapted from St. John in the early days of like the church and even the Yardbird Club? You mentioned vegetarian eating. What were some other ones?
So that was definitely big. Their belief that war on its face was immoral, and their belief in spiritual universalism or the universality of religious ideals. So Coltrane's first wife was a Muslim, a woman, by the way, who he maintained contact with even after the divorce. So they were always talking. And then his second wife, Alice Coltrane, was Hindu. And Coltrane himself, born in High Point, North Carolina, had been raised in a Christian tradition. So there's a lot of his music that reads as though it's intended for a Christian tradition. But the truth is that he openly speaks about the universality of religious ideals. And so what you get from that is the development of what Archbishop King has called Haqqism, which is an Islamic word embracing. It's about embracing the truth, right? Whatever the truth is, or whatever truths there are. I would say another thing that's really big is just watching what Coltrane does, particularly after he adds Alice Coltrane to his group, and realizing that there's a central role that women have to play in religious leadership and in the production of sound. So Mother Marina is very much a co-founder. Technically, Reverend Juanica is also a co-founder, though she was a child. She was there in that moment in which all this was founded. And then Archbishop King's mother was an important teacher. These are things that they openly were acknowledging and talking about in that moment. And then at a certain point in time in their development, I'm skipping a few things here that I should go back over, but at a certain point in time in their development, they are led by
Was
Alice
that the
Coltrane.
late 70s, if I remember correctly?
So they go.
Yeah.
Yes, right before the African Orthodox Church hears about them. So, they go from this listening clinic through a variety of iterations around the One Mind Temple or the One Mind Evolutionary Transitional Church of the Hour. There are a lot of different names for it. They're not looking for membership per se, but they are looking for devotion to Coltrane sound and thinking about Coltrane and his sound as, the best way that I can put this, I know that this will bother some people, but if you've experienced this, it makes perfect sense. Think about latter day books of a New Testament, but if they were written in sound, in a way that anybody speaking any language could access them. And then thinking about A Love Supreme or any Coltrane album that way.
Yeah, no, that's an incredible thought right there. I mean, just imagining, to your point, a universal language where everybody is open to it. It's not a matter of, what your political borders are, where you are in the world. We can all receive this message.
Right. And it's got the central tenets of what you're looking for in any of the Abrahamic religions, frankly, even the religions that come before the Abrahamic religions. So, listen, you can boil the Bible down to, if you had to boil it down to one word, that the only most important word in the book should be love. Of course, there are people in America who take other words, and put them front and center. Money being one other one, right? But love should be the most important word. And so there's so much within Coltrane that is about love, a love supreme, right? And so they're seeking after this. And then they go to visit Alice Coltrane, and they deal with her as the widow of God. And in presenting themselves in that way, she winds up in a relationship with them, keeping in mind that she's Hindu. So she winds up in a relationship with them where she turns this into a Vedanic center. And they are learning Sanskrit. They're singing the songs, chanting. Coltrane's being moved a little bit every day to the margin. And then the long and the short of it is that there are disputes that lead to a break, that lead to a lawsuit against the church for using Coltrane's name, a lawsuit that is eventually dropped, but that helps them to get to the attention of the African Orthodox Church. And that's where we are now. That's the short history of the church. Of course, I cover all of this in the Coltrane Church. I'm not trying to get people to buy it by,
it's a great story too. There's so much going on in it. So I guess from what you're talking about there, did Alice accept that idea of John as God incarnate, or was it more of a, I see an opportunity to grow spirituality and, honor my husband, but maybe I don't agree with that necessarily. What was her viewpoint?
I think, I've never asked the Archbishop that question, but in everything that he's ever told me, he has suggested to me that Alice understood that John Coltrane was a very special soul who was definitely seeking to be in communion with God and was in communion with God. I'm thinking about the things that she said because she was by his side when he died. And I think that I'm paraphrasing, but I think she said something along the lines of how beautiful it was to be there as his soul departed this world. Having understood that he had attained that oneness that he was seeking with God. And this is, almost a priest-like devotion for Coltrane, because he is doing nothing but practicing and performing and dedicating his music.
And even when you said devotion, I immediately thought of one of the things we found in the research and talked about on the episode was that the players who were with him for the previous 4+ years they would perform twice a day, nearly every day, and only taking breaks to record albums. So that's another kind of person who's seeing him as somebody to devote that kind of to devote your life to, basically.
Yeah, on one level, you look at the classic quartet and you say, McCoy Tyner, Jimmy Garrison, Elvin Jones, and John Coltrane. And you say, man, that's the greatest quartet probably in the history of jazz. There's probably not much of an argument there, right? But then those guys, when you read what those guys have said, and even as the group got bigger and it changed players and other people came in, well, everybody says the same thing, which is that they kind of understood that they were on a mission. And you certainly had to understand that you were on a mission when you understood that Coltrane refused treatment in his final years because it would have prevented him from playing for a while, if not forever. And that wasn't where he was going.
That time to communicate his message, and exactly, not waste away during treatment.
That's right. And you are looking at somebody who in many senses gave his life to continue to produce.
Well, I think the thing
sound.
for me that has made me absolutely adore him is all of that too is just coming from this core idea of I want to make music to make people happy. I want to share that with the world. And, I think it's such a lost concept anymore, when it comes to, like you talked about earlier, the capitalism behind, music and art and all these things. There's a lot of reasons people get into it, but it's not very often you hear that they just want to make people happy through what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think that, so you ask also the God question. And I think one way of thinking about this too is to use something that the folks in the Coltrane Church use, which is the work of the Sufi mystic Hazrat Inayat Khan, who acknowledges that sound is God. So we can think of, God being manifest within a human form, to be sure, and maybe talk about Coltrane as God or Coltrane as presenting a New Testament. But we can also think about God is sound, and if you this is not actually inconsistent with the Bible, where the world comes into being through vocalization. God is the word, literally the spoken word, which is sound, which is vibration, which is frankly the thing that distinguishes all things that are living, is vibration, movement, sound. We all have a sound, and Coltrane talks about
Mm.
I know a man by his sound. Rejecting other ways of thinking about people, like for example the color of your skin or your gender or your religious beliefs.
Right.
I know a man by his sound. That's who he is, right? That's another, there's a lot of metaphysical stuff in Coltrane that he was pushing towards and talking about, that the church has been studying
Yeah.
for 50, 60 years, right? I don't think you'll ever get to the bottom of it. And Coltrane himself acknowledges that there
I
is no
know
end to
that
this.
we never get the ending to the story, do we? We have to just keep digging and digging, and yeah, it's
No,
exactly.
no, and that's not the point either. Yeah. The point is always the journey. And again, these are not Western European perspectives, right? Where it's there's a path, there's a beginning, and there's an end. There is forever seeking and being in this and learning more, because
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
infinite, right?
And when you talked about, sound being, being a basis for that sort of thing, something we even talked about on, it might have been the Coltrane episode, but creativity, and now that I think about it, sound as a concept is one of the only things that we can, like, very, very positively note as something coming from nothing, or even, comparing it to, the very first parts of the book of Genesis. There's nothing,
Yeah.
and then there's something, and that the only times that I know that I can point that out and say, give it to somebody and say, here it is. It's creating something. It's creating art, but at its most, in its music, at its most basic, there's no sound, and then all of a sudden somebody is making a sound. There's nothing, and then there's something.
Yeah, that's really an interesting observation. In I think all of the spiritual texts that in our world that we've become familiar with, and certainly the ones that preceded the world that we inhabit, sound brings something into being, whether it's the sound of the trumpet or the sound of stringed instruments like the harp. And there's always space for learning. I think one of the things that I'm really humbled by Coltrane is a number of years ago I had a chance to visit the house in Philadelphia where his cousin Mary lived, and I did have a chance to speak with her. She didn't let me all the way up into the house. We were in the living room, but she would talk to me about where he was seated, how she would see him always coming down the stairs with his horn, how he was constantly practicing all the time new sounds. And I don't know if you guys have seen that documentary where it's actually in a couple documentaries,
Yes.
when he goes to Japan to present his music, right? And he's trying to pick up the sounds of Japanese instruments. And in addition to doing that, sort of as a companion to doing that, he goes to the memorial for the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and
Yeah,
prays
no,
for
the
them.
interviews that they did with, the people that were like his driver and his contacts on point and everything, they're absolutely just amazed by, how sincere and, thoughtful he was with all of it. And yeah, it's just one more reflection on the guy. Yeah, he's just
Yeah,
an incredible heart. Yeah,
he's trying to get to know the people and the place the way that he's come to
exactly.
understand the world through sound. And so, what are the sounds here? And what are the sounds here? What do they say about Japanese culture now in this post-war space? And how do I match that up with complete humility towards my audience and the people who have come here to hear me? Right? It's just there's a lesson here about
Right.
how to be a human being.
Compassion and understanding. And yeah, I mean, it's, yeah.
And listening, listeners are as valuable as musicians, right? So, Coltrane is always, you open up the liner notes, dear listener, because they're valuable. They're part of my community, musicians, listeners. And I want to hear all the sounds, and there are more sounds to hear. And as you listen to Coltrane, you hear so much. It's not like if you're a musician, you can't really break this down by saying, okay, well, Coltrane has a set group of tools that he plays with, right? So he's got his melodic minor, he's got his pentatonics, yada yada. He's got some 2-5-1 licks, yada yada. No, he's messing around with exotic scales at a certain point in time, building out of them, creating his own. It's beyond melodic minor and harmonic minor and all this other. He's pushing for what other people are doing, because as we know, there are not only other scales, there are literally other notes.
Right.
So can I get to those too, right? Because the Western scales themselves are limited. What about the notes in between the notes, which, by the way, you get to in the blues whenever
I never
you
thought
bend
of
a
it that
note,
way. Yeah.
because you're getting all those microtones, right? And then you also get to those when you play a sitar, which has the scalloped fretboard. I'm a guitar player,
Oh, we are
so
as
I'm really
well.
into
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
stuff, how you
Yeah.
can get to it. Oh, there you go. All right.
Everybody here is a guitar player now.
So you know that you're getting when you press down on those. I don't know if you've ever played an instrument with scalloped frets where they kind of cut out the fretboard
One time.
like
Yeah.
you do on a sitar. Well, you're getting all these. You say to yourself, okay, there's A and there's B flat, right? And then you play a sitar and you're like, dude, there's a lot of
Exactly.
notes between
Yeah,
A
the
and B
West kind of
flat.
took the easy route and just
Right.
kept it to 12 notes, like why are we doing this? Let's
Right.
expand. There's so much
Right.
more out there.
Yeah, and I think Coltrane's always attaining, trying to hear these things. I would be really interested. I like to speculate on these things. Okay, like what if Coltrane had lived to 100? Okay, and just been like, I don't know. I mean, just always able to play. What would he have gotten into? What would he have done with
No
the
kidding.
digital space? Electronic horns, I mean, probably stuff we haven't done yet, right?
Him and Hendrix are both, the conversation, that same idea of like, that's where
Right.
they started. Where would they have gone with another 40, 50 years? I mean,
Right.
goodness only knows. Yeah.
Yeah, because Hendrix is dreaming at night and then waking up and going, okay, how am I going to put that dream to sound? And these are also both guys who are like eating, sleeping, drinking the music. I mean, they're doing it all the time. Hendrix was
Right.
sleeping with the Strat.
Didn't leave his
right?
side. Yep.
So, I mean, yeah. So again, there's this monk-like existence towards this sound. Why? Because you have figured out, probably very early on, this is divine, that God is sound. And if you are seeking God, you can find God in this sound.
Oh, I just got to reflect on that one for a minute. That's just such a wonderful thought. I really love it.
Yeah.
It does. It
Gives you a
does.
new way
and
of
just,
thinking about music,
everything
right?
in life, because, it all is sound, to your point, even down to, the atomic level of vibration, you talked about. I mean, it's all sound.
Yeah, and I think that's what Archbishop King, Mother Marina, Pastor Juanica, all the members of the Coltrane Church understand. And I think that one of the great things about what they've done for 50, 60 years is that they have really been true disciples of this without, oftentimes you'll find people who are following a particular path, but then kind of insert their own agenda into it. But, I've never made any kind of evaluative judgments about what they do because I love them so much. And one of the issues that I had with publishing my book was that I went through a couple of publishers who kept telling me, look, this is not sound theology, and we want you to critique it. And my first response was, okay, so I'm not a theologian. My second response was, these folks are acting
Right.
in love, and there's nothing wrong when you act in love. And then the other piece is that the point of what I was writing in the book was, even if in your orthodox religious perspective you disagree with what they're doing, the point is that they're still doing it and they're building power out of it.
Yes.
And they are healing people with it. They're actually doing good in the world. And part of that has to do with the fact that they've stayed true to what that message was without adding some other kind of layer to it. Now, that has meant nobody's gotten rich off of this, okay? But I do think that this is a church that needs to expand, and we're talking about things like building an
that'd be
arts
amazing.
institute, and I'm hoping that can happen and start teaching people out of this, and helping to sustain the members who have devoted their lives to this, so that they can build some kind of a sustainable living from it, because that has not happened, right? And that's really a shame. But there's also this tremendous purity, this beautiful purity to what they have done. And you don't often see that in American religion. You see a lot of, hey, let me take this and figure out how I can
turn into a mansion real quick. Yeah.
And one of the things yeah, exactly. And one of the things that really endeared me very early on was just there wasn't an angle. I'm showing up when they had the property at Divisadero. I'm showing up and they're feeding. They get people wrapped around the block that they're feeding vegetarian meals to. And I knew churches, including the one that I grew up in, that had giant kitchens and only fed themselves. I mean, some of that has to do with the fact that they, they've read that deeply into Coltrane. Where Coltrane says things like, hey, I wish that through my sound, I could put some money in your pocket. Like I could actually manifest this thing for you with music. And so they start to think naturally, well, maybe we can. And maybe what that involves is playing the music, having these services, and then serving food to the poor after. And then they would do this thing at Divisadero, because they had a tiny kitchen in that facility. They would do this thing for Thanksgiving where you could go and come off the street as an unhoused person, and they would set up the sanctuary for dining, and you'd have your Thanksgiving meal,
I love
and then
that.
they would play music for you.
Yeah.
You'd treat you like a human being. You could have a meal and listen to
and
a
it wasn't about,
performance.
like you
It's
said, it
really
wasn't about getting
powerful.
anything in return. It was simply because that's, the thing that they knew they
Yeah.
should do.
No. Yeah, and that's the way Coltrane did things.
Nowadays, not trying to make a buck off of it is almost, it's part of the proof in the pudding. There's there, like that. Especially in America, that's the ulterior motive behind anything that has an ulterior motive. So when it's not there, it's easy to see when somebody's being
Yeah, I mean, I
being
think.
genuine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a thing where you want to make sure that folks can sustain themselves off the music. I think what offends people, or should offend people, maybe it doesn't offend people, is when, as you mentioned, you have the kind of mega church thing where they're telling you that something that's clearly not in the Gospels, and then everybody's
Right.
rolling away in a Rolls Royce, right? Up in the hills, that kind of deal, where it's just a scam. They've never looked for, they've never really been aggressive about membership. Certainly have not been aggressive about grant funding because they don't want to be beholden to anybody. And that's opened them up, or allowed them, I should say, to be able to do things like take part in the Oscar grant movement, take part in the movement to push back against foreclosures during the Great Recession, fight against police brutality in San Francisco.
They had a relationship with
things like
Huey
that.
Newton as well, if I recall. Was that correct? Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, Archbishop King studied with Huey Newton. He didn't become a Panther, but learned a lot from him about the class dimensions of this, right? So socialism, communism, a critique of capitalism, and also how that fit with spirituality, because Huey kind of understood Jesus Christ as a radical revolutionary. And if you look at the Bible, I mean, Jesus Christ is a figure who was essentially put to death by a colonial government. So he was a decolonizing, anti-colonial figure who was railing against high church authority and high government authority. How we get to a Jesus Christ who is about money, power, military expansion, whiteness, and death is you got to explain that one to me. But some of that begins when you start painting the names of saints on the
That's
slave
kind of
ships.
asking for some corruption to take hold there. Yeah. Yeah. Nick, I'm wondering if you can speak to Coltrane's struggles with his addiction and how that kind of helped shape his God consciousness and really gave him a bit of a rebirth.
Yeah, that's, one of the things that I think a lot of musicians were trying to do in Coltrane's era was to sound like Charlie Parker. And in order to do that, I think a lot of musicians decided that you had to do the things that Charlie Parker was doing. First and foremost, one of which was heroin. And then I think you have to also think about the ways in which there was a system that operated in the country where you had to have this cabaret card to perform. And if you got busted with drugs by the police, you could have your cabaret card taken away from you and your livelihood taken from you. It was also a way for police to give police sort of a rationale for infiltrating jazz communities, selling dope to jazz performers, putting them in compromising positions for one reason or the other. I mean, Billie Holiday is probably the greatest example of this in order to shut down her singing of Strange Fruit. Archbishop King has talked with me about this a lot as part of a broader conspiracy. And I 100% agree with him. And I agree with, if you look at the structure of the laws, the way the dope was pushed, where the dope comes from, the federal authorities who were involved undercover in pushing some of this stuff, you're looking at a pretty broad conspiracy against Black America for a number of decades. And I'm not saying that it's over. And some of that happened in the crack era. And so Coltrane becomes, like a lot of other musicians, uh, caught up in this. By the way, not all the musicians who got caught up in this were black. You have, white folks who were with black musicians who were caught up in this too. And yeah, exactly. I agree exactly. I think that there's also a particular way of thinking about, from the perspective of FBI or police, thinking about a musician or a jazz musician, and also thinking about the origins of the music and what jazz means, literally means, as a colloquial term that may have referenced having sex. Because this was a music that was born in the red light districts in New Orleans. It has particular connotations. We don't think of it this way anymore because now we play it in expensive halls, concert venues, but that's not where the music was born. And it's also not where blues comes from either. These are profoundly secular forms that come in spaces where people are experiencing the extremes of life. And so Coltrane deals with this in, I think, probably one of the most difficult ways, which is you go home, you put yourself on a bread and water diet. Literally, you go to your mama's home, you lock yourself up in your bedroom, you go on a bread and water diet, and you kick it. But then, what happens, and this is what a love supreme is all about. When you're doing that, what if in the midst of doing that, God comes to you and says, it's going to be all right. I got you. And and he says that that's what happened, and that thereafter he devoted his music to God and to the things that could be done with this divine sound, probably recognizing in the moment the degree to which he had distorted the very gift that he had been given, and would now move forward with a new sensibility about how to approach that. I think that Coltrane is also a patron saint for addicts, and I write about him in the book as a kind of a sort of a necessary saint, not just because he's a late 20th century figure and he's black, but also because he's an addict and because he's been there where you've been when you've been at your lowest point. And to have somebody who has been where you've been when you've been at your lowest point, and then to demonstrate to you that, not only can you lead a clean life, but a productive life that is filled with love, and in which you can give love and you can still do something that's really good for the world.
No, that's an amazing thought. I mean, to think, this isn't somebody that's perfect. This is a human being that you can relate to and, really get behind that struggle and relate to it, as opposed to just, this guy never failed, this person never did wrong. As a human being, I can't relate to that. So to hear somebody like Coltrane's story, it really hits home for me.
I don't know of a more positive message than that. And I don't know of a more, of a better cause for any form of worship. Go and find the people who are hurting the most, because it is what's in the Gospels. That's what Jesus did. You go find the people that are hurting the most, and you reach out to them and you offer them a way out. And that's what you do. Yeah, and I saw a lot of people over the many years that I've been with the Coltrane Church. I've seen so many people who just came from absolutely nothing, nowhere. And even if they weren't musicians, they were listeners and they could listen. And then they understood what was going on here and the way that the church was using Coltrane to make accessibility, the love of God, all of that fully accessible to you in a way that you could understand. Because the very first thing you're going to say is, it wasn't your patron saint a drug addict? And the next thing you're going to say is, yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're not going to run from it. Right.
He sure was, and look what he achieved anyway. Drug addict or not, the man led a great life and overcame adversity, and it's inspiring to all of us.
Right. And so now you get it, right? They never run away from that. And I think that that's, you heard me earlier saying that I think that what they're doing here is clearly the truest form of Christian worship, or spiritual worship, because I think it's more than just Christian, that you can build around Coltrane's ideas without distorting a single one of his ideas or twisting them or saying, no, we have a new interpretation. They never do that. They never say, yeah, Coltrane said this, but here's what he actually meant. No, you know what Coltrane said in that quote. He's a very plain speaking person, or he was, and here it is. And so they keep it as it is. And so they don't run away from things like, he was an addict. Yeah, he was an addict. And guess what? A lot of people in this church, in this building at this point, may have been addicts too. So what?
And it sounds like, they ended up in the right church. I mean, a church and a belief system and some ideas that are more about compassion and, respecting, them as human beings despite their struggles. And I think that's just incredible.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, the compassion, all of that. I think that's really important now. We do exist in a world that, to some extent, and maybe it's just the intense surveillance in our world, but sometimes you do ask yourself, hey, where's the forgiveness? I mean, we're all messing up. Right.
So, Nick, I'm wondering if you can tell our listeners and us as well, what is a service like at the Church of Coltrane? What goes on? Is it all about the music? Is it all about the sound? What do you guys do to celebrate?
Great question. So you have not been to a church service? Have you even seen any of their YouTube services or snippets on Instagram or Facebook? Have you ever seen any of those?
I have seen some of the videos, and that's just another one of the things, from researching the church, like how incredible it all is just seeing the energy behind it all and, how music plays a part in it. But yeah, I'd love to hear more.
Okay, so what they have done is they have created something that's called the Coltrane Liturgy. And I'm going to break this down for you in what I call, and this is just me, okay? The Archbishop and Mother Morena they probably don't feel differently than this, but this is a caveat, okay? This is sort of the way that I encountered it when I first encountered the Coltrane Church in '94. Now, technically, I grew up in San Francisco. I had known about them for a long time. I even had a classical guitar teacher who lived on the same block and would always complain about the sound. But anyways, and then I would see them. My dad was a musician and a classically trained clarinetist, And we would purposely, and he introduced me to jazz. My dad taught me how to listen to jazz, and then tried to teach me a little bit on guitar. But we would visit their airport ministry all the time. So they've kind of always been around. But when I first went in 94, my thing was, okay, nobody's going to play Coltrane's music. I mean, come on. He was a genius. You're not doing that. You're going to sit around and listen to records. So I walk in and I'm expecting a couple of turntables, Yeah, and then you got priests coming down from it's sort of like an some little steps down into the sanctuary. I always thought of this as like the upper room there at Divisadero, and they're coming out with the horns and they're just blowing Africa, right? So this was how it would begin, and you would get a sequence of songs to which there's also a choir, the Sisters of Compassion, who would sing elements of an Orthodox liturgy to Coltrane's music. And then, match in things, you get this in Africa as well. You match in things like chanting John Coltrane while the horns are blaring the tune Africa. And then people have taken solos off of this as well. This is where you kind of get a blend of Pentecostal worship, which is the Archbishop's background, and mine as well. So I recognized it immediately, where the Holy Ghost is falling in the improvisation, as a soloist is losing it. So you get Africa, pardon me if I don't get this completely right, a love supreme, acknowledgement. There would be this wonderful moment. It was always my favorite moment of the service when a minister of music, Frederick Harris, who is one of the Bay Area's great jazz pianists. He's also a drummer, and his daughter is an amazing drummer who's playing in New York and in Europe. I think she's in Europe now, Savannah. He would play a solo piano intro to Lonnie's Lament. And what he would do, because Fred is such a gifted musician, Fred would sometimes start out with the origins of Black music and work his way through the evolution. So you'd start hearing, like Boogie Woogie and, all this other kind of stuff. And then before you knew it, he was right into Lonnie's Lament. And it was meant as a kind of a meditative moment after, you'd had the intensity that opened the service. And then you'd have, the preached word. And then you might get some other songs like you could end with Tunji, for example, or formally end the service with After the Rain. With everyone, again, the Sisters of Compassion chanting the lyrics for that.
Oh, wow. That sounds absolutely amazing.
Right? And so it had this emotional arc to it. And that's essentially what the Coltrane Liturgy is. It's this arrangement of select Coltrane pieces with integrating aspects of the liturgy, including, by the way, the 23rd Psalm, which Mother Marina would often sing to, I believe she would sing that to a love supreme acknowledgement. And then, and it had this emotional arc to it, that had this deep meditative moment, but also these incredible moments of joy and exaltation. Now they do it a little differently, for every service. A lot of that has to do with the availability of musicians now showing up at the Magic Theater. But for me, that was kind of the classic way that they did it, when they had 3 or 4 horns, drummer, pianist. Sometimes there used to be a violinist who would come. It was really powerful. I'd never experienced anything like it before. In fact, the first time that I attended a service, I was kneeling, and I remained kneeling through some of the different song cycles until one of the sisters came to me and said, you don't have to remain kneeling, right? But I was just like, oh my God. Wow. Yeah.
They tell you don't have to, but you were thinking to yourself, or do I?
It's a little different now than when they would perform. It's not a performance, so let's X that word out. When they would, when the liturgy was, I don't know the right verb to use, but back in the Divisadero days, it was a little bit different. And by the way, they will do it when they are on the road. I've had the opportunity to be with them in Paris many years ago when they did it, and what they're showing you is the liturgy that they do. They are holding a church service for you.
So the church does have the opportunity to kind of get out there and spread the word outside of the city.
Yeah, lately what it's been twice yearly. There's a performance at Grace Cathedral. And you may want to attend one of those. There should be another one later this summer. So let's stay in touch, and I'll get you information on that.
Sounds like a Indy 500 road trip might be in order here.
Yeah, or catch an Amtrak and come on.
I definitely still want to get the info just in case.
So I'm curious, we're a little bit of ways from the church itself up in Seattle here, but what are some ways that we can help contribute, get the word out there? How can we support this?
Yeah, so they have on their website, they have a St. John Coltrane global spiritual community to which you can become a part of. You can join the mailing list. By the way, when they say global spiritual community, they get people from all over the globe who talk about how Coltrane's music has affected their lives, whether that be, they were in a foxhole somewhere in the middle of some war, and all of a sudden, boom, they heard Coltrane's music. Oh, and by the way, now that I'm actually going to the website as we're talking, to resolve a question we had earlier, the quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on jazz was from the 1964 speech at the Berlin Jazz Festival, because they have put that up on their website. So on the website, you have a notification of the masses, which occur Sunday at 11. Ways to join the mailing list in the global spiritual community. Contribute if you like. They do have prayer cloths. Some people call them T-shirts. They are referred to as prayer cloths that you might want. Church artwork that you can have, as well as used to be a copy of Coltrane Speaks, which has the all the quotes. Trying to find it on the website. You should be able to get that. I'm not seeing it right now, but yeah, you should be able to get that. And then there's also a radio ministry on local KPOO FM. I don't know if you can get KPOO on Odyssey. I know you can get it on TuneIn, though. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to get in touch with them. And then, they do have contact email and phone where you can connect with them too. Uh, Certainly, the mailing list will keep you up with just about everything. And then they have the social media feed too, Facebook feed, all of that.
Yeah, lots of great ways then to stay in the loop and to learn more about the church. And looking at the the website before. The artwork on there that's for sale is super cool. Same with the prayer cloths and everything. So advise people to check that out for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Nick, I do want to just take a second to thank you, so much for all your time today, all the great information you shared, and, really inspiring stories that I know I'm going to be walking away with a changed perspective on a few things. And, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I know it's made my day, and I'm sure my co-host Brady as well.
Well, it's made my day talking to you guys too, because you're real listeners. And I think that's, we need more great musicians in the world. And also there are great musicians in the world. It's difficult to find them sometimes because of the way that the media, the music corporate circus works, and the people that they choose to elevate. But we need great listeners. And you guys are great listeners. And I also want to hear, you guys both said that you're guitar players. I want to hear you two as well.
Well, my last question I was going to ask, and hopefully it won't take too long, but related to playing guitar and other music, are there any other albums or musicians, as we go down our list? It's on the main show, it's us talking about. There was a British magazine, the NME, where they did a top 500 albums. And it's all like 2013 going all the way back to the 50s. Are there any artists or albums that might be on there that we should keep a lookout and be like, oh, we should check in with Nick?
Yeah, I would definitely look at Alice Coltrane, Journey in Satchidananda. I would definitely do that. And I would also, if I were you, look at the work of Ravi Coltrane, who has been important to the church. I would actually welcome you to do a broadcast on everyone that played with Coltrane or was influenced by Coltrane. So, because
that sounds like a pit stop part two with with your notes, huh?
Yeah, I'd be willing to get on that program with you and go through what I think are some classic albums or tracks by people who played with Train, were influenced by Train, and really give an assessment of what the Coltrane school of thought has been.
Yeah, definitely.
On the Love Supreme episode, we actually, did a little bit of a family tree, so to speak, breakdown of Miles Davis and how he intertwined with John Coltrane throughout his career. And, really just looking at the list of musicians that, he played with is just astounding too. So I can imagine, following that tree from Coltrane, not only his family, but just the people that played with him over the years would be an absolutely incredible journey.
I mean, and I think starting with his family, in particular, Ravi and definitely Alice Coltrane, but then there's also Orrin Coltrane's work too. So he's Ravi's brother. He does some jazz and some pop inflected stuff as well. So all of that could be a really interesting exploration.
So as we wind down here, Nick, I'm just kind of curious if you have any remaining thoughts or words you'd like to share about the church.
Yeah, they need your support. For everybody who's listening to this, they need your support. They need willing workers. If there's any expertise that you have to bring that can help in any way, and it may be unexpected, it may be in a way that you don't even know, but you have a heart to participate in helping them, I think that you should think about reaching out to them, becoming a part of the global spiritual community. There is a place where Pastor Wanika, soon to be Archbishop Wanika, is going to want to take this, where Archbishop King and Mother Marina want to take this as the last part of their legacy. And some of that will be around an Institute of the Arts. And we're trying to figure out how to do that, what that might offer to the community in terms of music lessons, how that would be consistent with Coltrane's vision when he put together the triumvirate in the last years of his life. But yeah, I would just encourage people, if they're moved, to take part, get active. There is work to be done. We can find work for you.
Not sure yet how we're going to help, but I know we're going to be reaching out to try and do our part.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate
never thought I'd be saying it for the podcast, but please definitely go contribute and support this church.
I appreciate that, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming on.
Feels like community. We got to get together face to face and break bread together and listen.
Thank you once again, Nick. Absolute treasure of an interview and moment for us on this podcast. So really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I would watch this.
All right. Stay in touch. All right. Bye-bye.